Ladies and gentlemen, there are so many questions being asked. There is a rural question, the northern question, and I think there is an African question. But the questions are asked, but the answers are very difficult to arrive at. Now, Uganda was a British colonial project. It was never our project. And Uganda before 1902 was much bigger than it is today. And Amin tried to talk about it and was quickly told to shut up. Uganda before 1902 went as far as Nakuru and went as far as the middle of southern Sudan. And of course, the settler question in Kenya had not become so important. But at around 1902, the settlers were coming into Kenya and they wanted something bigger than the East African Protectorate, as it was called at that time. And so they took off a huge chunk of Uganda. And the boundaries of Uganda were eventually arrived at in 1930. Before that, they wanted to take in Sebei and Bugishu to be part of Kenya. And the good Bagishu and Sebei people took out their spears. They didn't want to be swallowed by the settlers of Kenya. And that's how Bugishu and Sebei were saved. By 1930, the boundaries of Uganda had been settled. One of the things that the British did, the first things they did, was to build a railway from Mombasa to Kisumu to Lake Narubari. And that was initially for defensive and offensive purposes. And they wanted to control the headwaters of the Nile. And they thought that if they facilitated transportation, then they would have better control of the region. And so we got that railway. Of course, did other things. It transported merchandise, and it became a critical part of our economy in Uganda. So, Uganda changed the boundaries, and even the internal boundaries of the various provinces and districts were delineated by the colonialists. Boundaries in in the pre-colonial period did not make much sense because we had different cultures and they understood land in different ways. For instance, the pastoralists did not have a sense of the patria because whenever there was grass and water, there was pasture for the animals, that was their land. So the pastoralists kept moving around. Those with a clearer sense of the patria were the agriculturists. Animals move, but crops don't move. So those stuck to certain areas. And Buganda was mainly agricultural. And that's why they had a more developed sense of the patria. One of the huge chunks of Uganda, and which lies mainly in Uganda, is generally neglected. But it is high time we began to take this part of Uganda very seriously. Because when the colonial demarcations were made, Tanganyika, Kenya, Uganda, 45% of Lake Naruwari is Uganda, 6% is Kenya, and 49% is Tanzania. And during the 19th century, Buganda had a navy. And by the time of Mutesa the First, we had a navy of around 30,000 boats, patrolling not only what was given to us by the colonialists, but going as far as Mwanza. And Lake Naruwari was a major economic hub for the region. And I dare say that in the 19th century, there was greater business and greater traffic on that lake than today. And water transport was taken extremely seriously. So when we ask for the Maila Kenda, we should also be asking for the 11,600 square miles that our part of the water covers, because all this was Buganda. And normally, we don't talk about water. The archipelago, the Sessa archipelago, was a key factor in the defense of Uganda. It connected us to the outside world. And Sessa was of great strategic importance, therefore. Now, when the British come, and there is a great fallacy that the Baganda collaborated. Well, yes, there were some client chiefs who collaborated, but Mwanga, you know the story of Mwanga very well, he fought the British. So when the idea of the British Uganda colonial project comes in, not everybody embraced it. Lwanga and his people, and they were in the majority of Uganda. And Kabarega and his people did not embrace the project. And in fact, resisted the project, contested the project. And that's how they both ended up in the Seychelles, because they were overpowered. But the idea of contestation will not die. In fact, Lwanga's son, Chua, was almost deported for contesting aspects of colonial rule, but he was saved by an early death, because before they could make arrangements to deport him, he died a very premature death at the age of 53. So what the Bush did, and I've written a long essay somewhere on the colonial roots of internal conflict in Uganda. The Buganda client chiefs, and by the way, the greatest land grab we had in Uganda was the 1900 land grab under that agreement, where about 1,000 chiefs got half the territory of mainland Uganda. And so there's a story that, you know, the Sudanese mercenaries had rebelled in the 1997-98, around the same time as Lwanga started his war of independence from Buddha. And Kagwa and other chiefs spearheaded the fight against the Sudanese in the Bukarevo and Busoga. Without the assistance of Kagwa and chiefs of like mind, the British would have definitely have left Uganda around 1898. They were in fact considering. But a lot of Buganda under Kagwa lost their lives, but defeated the Sudanese mutineers. And the Queen at that time was so grateful that he offered the Baganda, those Baganda who had fought for them in Bukarevo, whatever they asked for, they wanted. Whatever they wanted, the Queen would give it to them. So they consulted their friends in Namirembe, especially Reverend Miller. And Miller advised them to ask for land, because he was well acquainted with the British land system, and the one that Miller suggested for us. We had a completely different land system in Uganda. Now, that is what brought the Buganda project. the Buganda National Project to its knees. They would have asked for a protectorate of their own without involving other nationalities of Uganda, and I think they would have got it, because down south, Eswatini, they got it. Lesotho, they got it. But because of the stupidity, because of the greed of Kagwa and his acolytes, they saw the bait of land, and they got plenty of land. But even Kagwa began to realize in the 1920s that they did not have the power. That power now had been taken by the British. And Kagwa died a very disappointed man, a very disillusioned man, because he thought he had the power, but he realized belatedly that he did not have this power. Now, the British found Buganda a credible nation. They had a patriot, although there were contestations of this patriot. They had a language. They had a highly developed system of administration, and this was greatly admired and formed the basis of colonial administration all around what became Uganda. And in order to strengthen, and it was cheap because you didn't need too many white men to come and do the administration. You use these agents, Baganda agents, and they establish the same system outside Uganda. And that's where the problems of Baganda and Uganda started. When they used us as their colonial agents, this caused a lot of resentment, because Uganda was not the only nation around. There are many nations, but the other systems were subsumed under the Buganda administrative system, and that's what caused a lot of resentment and even rebellion in some places, like the Nyangire rebellion in Bunyoro in 1907 was caused by the overbearing attitude of the Baganda agents in those places. By 1930, there was so much opposition to the agency system that most of the agents, virtually all the agents, were withdrawn from outside Uganda, withdrawn from those places where they performed, especially all around the country, because even if you go to Gulu today, you will find Savadu, Kochino, and the rest. If you go to Ankara, it's the same. And this caused a lot of resentment. Also, the churches used Baganda as their catechists, both in the Anglican and Catholic Church. And I'm sure the early Muslim sects also came from here and spread the word of God to other places. So this caused resentment. And one of the characterizations of the Baganda at that time, and I think it continued for a very long time, was that the Baganda were arrogant. That was one of the characterizations. The other one was that the Baganda were thieves. Of course, they were the first people in Uganda to be socialized into the money economy, right? And the first people to use money. And therefore, when you're using money, and others are not using it, you're trading, and they're giving you goods in kind, then you introduce money, then it is easy to be characterized as a thief. And of course, when you make profits, some people think of that as theft. And of course, Karl Marx said that property is theft. So none of us here is not a thief, but at least you have got somebody to property. So what happened? What happened was this. Nationalism, Uganda nationalism, began as economic nationalism. First of all, the cooperative movement started here. Then people like Musazi began in the cooperatives, began their political careers in the cooperatives. And this economic nationalism in the 1950s was characterized by the formation of political parties. And Musazi, Abu Mayanja, and others in Uganda started the Uganda National Congress in 1952. It was first led by Uganda. That is how they were beginning to embrace the Uganda project. And between 1952 and 1960, so many parties were formed. Musazi's party, the Uganda National Congress, attracted cooperators from across the country. The Magezis, the Felix Onamas, the Obwangos, they were in the cooperative movement and joined the UNC. And the Baganda leadership in the Uganda project began, but was not sustained. It was not sustained because there was another power center which was very important at that time, and that was Mengo. It was a major power center. And good old Andrew Cohen, when he came in, his mandate was to create a unitary Uganda state. That was his mandate. And through the Legislative Council and even the Executive Council, he was the first to bring Africans into the Executive Council. The Rulés, the Mungonyas, the Nabetas. This was part of the interim mandate of Cohen. Sandro Cohen. Now, as I indicated, the Buganda project was sunk in 1900 by our own people. If Kagwa, Mugwanya, Kisingiri, Amakasa had joined Mwanga, I don't think they would have sustained the state here, the colony within here. And if they had done so with this unity, then the Baganda were in a position to ask for their own separate colony, or separate protectorate as they are called. But these people did not realize that the Buganda project had been sunk. And that is why, in the 1950s, in fact, I think it was 1953, Kabaka Mutesa II asked for an autonomous Uganda. And that's when the Buganda independent movement began. Cohen had come in with another agenda, unitary Uganda. And that's why the Kabaka was exiled. Now, by the early I think the first Baganda lawyers qualified in the late 30s. I think they qualified in the late 30s, but Chironde qualified in the... We had lawyers qualified in British law schools, and they don't seem to have understood, or if they understood, they feared to tell Mengo or that this agreement was not binding to the British. It bound them at their own pressure. It had no legal basis. And they could have pointed that out in the early 1950s. Chironde was here, Luyimbaz was here, and they could have told Mengo that this agreement was not recognized under British law. It was a very lopsided sort of agreement. They knew, of course, but they did not tell those leaders at Mengo the truth. Now, Uganda Nation had begun with the cooperatives in Uganda, spreading to other places where the cooperative movement was strong. But in the 1950s, non-Baganda began to seriously contest leadership positions within Uganda. And unfortunately, and I dare say to this very moment, Ugandan nationalism has tended to be defined in terms of non-Baganda. If you are of demonizing the Baganda, it is a kind of hatred for the Baganda, and people have built their nationalisms around anti-Baganda sentiments because of the way the Baganda were used during the colonial period as agents and so on. And of course, There was another element. Uh, the economy of cash crops also began here. Cotton and then coffee. And although the Baganda suffered under the regime of coffee and cotton and grossly underpaid, they did slightly better than others in terms of the economy. And then, of course, the major institutions were all here, the hospitals, the schools, and even the universities. They're all here. And this caused resentment. And many so-called nationalists have built their nationalism on anti-Baganda sentiments. You can contest it, but as far as I know, that is the truth, as far as I know it. Now, that is why we could have, people have tried to build nations, and you have heard of Bismarck, who used violence, blood and iron. That was how he built the German nation. Blood and iron. Now, for the last 60 years or so, we have also tried to be Bismarckian, to use violence to try and build the nation. But we haven't made very much success. The violence we have used, but you cannot tell me that the nation has really been built. So, some of our young, brilliant political scientists are here. It is now you are challenging Seven Kumba and others to find another way to build a nation. No, I believe that the questions we ask, the Renzururu question, the Buganda question, and other questions, the northern question, and so on, come about. We ask these questions when there is aggression and when there is oppression. I think this is why these questions are asked. In the case of Africa, if you talk about the Africa question, I think it is a question of gross exploitation for the last 700 years. They come here, they take our people, they come here, they take our whatever riches we have. And I think we have a question, and I think it is the question of exploitation if you use Africa. If you take the Renzururu question, my friend Shimba is not here yet. They felt oppressed by the Batoro. And that's why there was that uprising. And that oppression and suppression has continued in one way or another up to the present. And violence has not been able to really solve it. Now, some years ago, one of our leading journalists in the region, Onyango Bo, wrote an article about the Baganda. And that article led me to the conclusion that there was a Buganda question. This is what he said. He said that in the politics of Uganda, although the Baganda are the most central, they are spectators in the politics of Uganda. And spectators, the players are different, but we are just the spectators. And that sank in, but it hurt me that given the contribution of Buganda, socially, economically, and so on, to this country, we should be so peripheral in the political affairs of the country. So that was Onyango Obo a few years ago. And then, sometime this year, President Museveni apologized to the Baganda. It's not clear what the apology was all about, but he apologized. That also led me to think that there is a Buganda question. Is it because we are oppressed? Is it because we are unloved? There are relationships which they call love-hate relationships. You admire some and you hate some, and that's the love-hate relationship. Or is it a love-hate relationship? And now, Buganda. You see, a lot of things have happened. My own personal experience and our personal experiences. I was born about 3 miles from here, on that road to the lake. And my village was called Bugabo. That was the village where I grew up. Just 3 miles from here, on that road. There are about 15 villages between here and the lake. And they have all been subsumed under the name Garuga. Right? Isn't that true? Now, Buganda, which stretches another 11,000 square miles deep into Lake Naru Valley, is called the Central Region. Not Buganda, is the Central Region. And even if you were to get your geography right, it could at least be called the South Region or the Southern Region, because if you had another 11,000 square miles of water, which is all Buganda, then you are really in the south. But we are now called Central Region. Other places have retained their names, but Buganda has disappeared. I thought that there is a problem there. And that Buganda, at least as a geographical region, should be reclaimed. So, to some, that becomes a question. Now, Buganda was the superpower around this region. The Inter-Lacustrine region, it was the superpower. And it was, as well as a land power, it was a water power as well. We had a navy and so on. And Buganda was built on assimilation, the capacity to assimilate people. And this assimilation project began in the middle of the 18th century. Mawanda, followed by Junja and others, they were great assimilators. Once you got the language, once you got the norms, the basic norms, once you got into the clans, then you were in Uganda. And it pains me when they call the Baganda tribe. It really pains me because Buganda has been a nation since at least the middle of the 18th century. And Buganda became great because of her capacity to assimilate. Now, people became Baganda after generation. In the past, after one generation, people would become a Baganda. And you see, there are so many wars that the Baganda fought with their neighbors. But most of these wars were wars of passion and nothing. Yeah, they were wars of passion. For instance, a lot of wars were fought with the Banyankole, the Basagara. We called them Basagara. Their cows are Sagara, and the people are Basagara. Because of the built, the way their women are built. So these were mainly wars of passion. We go and get women, and then these women, children are born. They are Uganda. And that is why I would challenge anybody to find me a Muganda who is pure, who is not mixed up. Because miscegenation has been taking place for almost 3 centuries. And that is why, and Buganda held it together because of that quality of assimilation and then the institution of monarchy, which brought all these people together as Basajja ba Kabaka, Abazana ba Kabaka, and so on. And even today, any Ugandan who is anybody has got property in Uganda. And Buganda is a microcosm of Uganda. And that's why when it comes to the politics of Uganda, Buganda should be a good example of how the rest of the nation can be built. To go back to Onyango Obo, we are spectators. And I had Kaindo Tafiri, I think 2 days ago, say that he doesn't know why we roast the meat and then run away from it. That's what he said. So why, according to General Kahindo Tafiri, why do we run away from the meat, which we have helped, we have slaughtered it, we have even roasted it, but then we run away from it? You see, Now, this is a generalization. You may believe or not believe it. The Baganda are too trusting. Um, Obote came here when Musaz was the leader of UNC. And he gave up the leadership in favor of Obote. One of the reasons he did it was he thought that this, I think, was going to unite the people more. He was going to unite the people, and Obote himself was the master of the politics of dissimulation. Of course, he was a master at ingratiation, very great ingratiator. And of course, we must not forget that religion, foreign religions, polarize the Uganda society. The Catholics fought the Anglicans and vice versa. The Muslims fought the Christians and vice versa. So, and of course, this helped colonialism. To divide people, they're easier to rule when you divide them. And so that was one great divide within the Uganda polity, within the Uganda society. The only link that we're left with were the clans. And please, you should tamper with anything else, but please don't tamper with our clans, because that's what links us. And that's where our identity is obtained from. So, religion confused the political situation, and this worked in favor of Obote. But Obote, and this is why we are so trusting, Obote had made at a rally, at a rally in Voice in 1960, I wasn't there, but it was in the papers. He made a speech at a rally and said, I will destroy Uganda. Yes, in black, at a rally, and that was reported widely. And 6 months later, we had come into an alliance with him, Kabaka Yeka. And Mutesa, the second in his book, the Desecration of My Kingdom, talks about it and says, well, we thought these are the talk of a politician, and he was not serious about it. But the man was dead serious. And Mutesa was smoked out of his palace just a few years later in 1966. Literally smoked out of his palace. And because we are too trusting, we believe that others will behave the way we behave. And I think experience has shown that this is not the case. Because we have had other alliances, and they turned out to be disappointing. So the Buganda question, I think, is there. And one of the people I admire who tried to think very serious about the Uganda question was a lady called Kamya. Kamya, Betty Kamya. She wrote a masterpiece on federalism and formed the Federal Alliance. The Federal Alliance, yes, but the ideas were brilliant. Now, you see, in 1997, I had an opportunity to go to Chogam in Scotland, Edinburgh. And before that, I hadn't been to Scotland, and I didn't know that the Scotch had a Bank of Scotland and actually issued the currency, right? Yes. But the notes were used across the UK, but I think they were interchangeable, but they had their own currency. And this is a union between Scotland and England, which goes back to 1707, when they had the Act of Union. And I've heard noises, you hear noises in Scotland, that they want their own independence. After so many years, they want their own independence. Now, since we have wasted so much time in Uganda fighting internecine wars inside our country, people have died, resources have been wasted. Why don't we try something else? If the Bismarckian formula is not going to work, why don't we try something else? Countries like Switzerland are very small countries in terms of size. They are very small, with 4 cantons or counties. But Switzerland is a federation, and it is a very successful federation. And every year, I think every 2 years, they rotate presidencies from one canton to the other, so that the average Swiss does not know who the president is, because the turnover is so high. So why don't we look at Kamya's proposals once again? Whatever has happened to her, why don't we try to look at them? Why don't we try to look at Ruchamuzi's proposals? Because I think in the lead up to the 1995 Constitution, the Odochi report shows very clearly that the majority of Ugandans wanted a federal system. Right? In fact, 67% of Ugandans, the whole of Uganda, wanted a federal system. And I think that's a majority. They are the mathematicians. In Uganda, it was 98%. So why didn't this appear in the Constitution? The majority in Uganda, the overwhelming majority in Uganda, why did it appear at all? How did it disappear? I think earlier this year, people died of hunger in Karamoja. Wasn't it this year? Yeah. They died of hunger. But every day, 1,000 tons of marble come from Karamoja. Leave Karamoja. We are not talking about gold, we are not talking about lime. But the Karamojong are slightly less than 1 million people. Really, can't that marble, the small fraction of that marble, feed them? If they were in charge of their resources, most of their resources, the Kamadong do not need cows to survive. They can survive on their minerals. So we recognize that the Uganda project is there to stay. But if we want peace, and if we want development, and we have wasted so many years fighting one another, not fighting the outside world, but fighting one another. If we want to really develop our nation, we could reconsider the federal option. Use some of your resources, where some will be taken by the central government for defense and other purposes. But as far as we are concerned, and 60 years is a long time, places like Singapore moved from first to third to first world in 30 years. And in fact, Dr. Sentogo may know that because you were, I think, already in the civil service, that they were benchmarking. Lee Kuan Yew came to Uganda to benchmark to see, because we got our independence in 62 and they got theirs in 64. So during that period, they came to Uganda to benchmark because we were a star in this part of the world. And they made it 30 years, 60 years, we don't know where we really are. So there is the Buganda question. I believe we are, as Obo put it, spectators. We are not in the field. And if you try to get into the field, you are thought of as an intruder. And then the anti-Baganda sentiments will pull you down. Now, there's something new, and I don't understand it. And not only in Uganda, in fact, Uganda is very new. Do you understand this Generation Z? I don't understand it very well, but one thing that seems to have happened is that they are overcoming fear. That generation is overcoming fear inexorably. You talk to many young people here. Hey, how are you? Nafadda. Haven't you heard of that? Nafadda. Now, that is mainly the Gen Z generation. Yeah, now, if somebody has nothing to lose, it becomes very dangerous. And we should watch out. And the only way we can save, in fact, some of us will be eaten without even putting salt. They will just eat us. So there is a Buganda question, and I think as it was in the Independence Constitution, and the Uganda Constitution, the independence was a botched affair because it was so many things. But if they had offered And not many Ugandans participated in the making of that constitution. But if they had offered federation across the board, right, according to regions and so on, I think we wouldn't be in the kind of situation we are today. And there are two ways. You can either persist in the use of violence and see where that gets us, or you can do it peacefully, sit down again. We don't even need to sit down. We have to bring out the Odoche report and say, why don't we follow this? So there is a Uganda question, a Rwenzururu question, a northern question, and most of these have cost us a lot of blood. And I think we should go into another direction.